China's signature project, the Belt and Road Initiative, reaches a new milestone. During the first 6 months of 2025, BRI activity hit a record high with construction contracts and investments totaling $124 billion, with some 176 deals. That's according to a joint study by Fudan University's Green Finance and Development Center and the Australia-based Griffith University. Africa and Central Asia also emerged as top destinations, attracting $39 billion and $25 billion, respectively. Later, we'll hear from analysts about the impact of BRI in Africa, but we begin in Beijing with more on China's engagement. Let's watch what the Chinese Foreign Ministry had to say.
In Belt and Road Cooperation, China follows the principles of planning together, building together, and benefiting together, the philosophy of open, green, and clean cooperation, and the goal of pursuing high-standard, people-centered, and sustainable cooperation, and is committed to promoting the modernization of all the countries.
More than 150 countries and 30 international organizations on 5 continents have joined China's Belt and Road Initiative since it was launched in 2013. Joining us now from Bali is Gita Wirjawan. He's a former Indonesia Trade Minister and visiting scholar at Stanford University. And Einar Tangen is a senior fellow with the Taihe Institute and founder and chair of Asia Narratives. He joins us from Beijing. Thanks to both of you for being with us. Einar, let's begin with that report that I was talking about. That's a report from Fudan University's Green Finance and Development Center and the Griffith University, which is based in Australia. It says that in the first 6 months of this year, construction contracts and investments through the Belt and Road Initiative totaled $124 billion. That's more than all of 2024 at $122 billion. Beijing describes this as a new phase of high-quality development. What can you tell us about Beijing's engagement?
Well, I mean, this is stark contrast. What you have today is Donald Trump's, it looks like his trade war is fizzling. And as he erects trade barriers, Beijing is following along, as it has for the last 11 years, to try to build trade bridges. So, you know, you were mentioning that number, you know, there was $57 billion that were invested, and there was another $66 billion in construction contracts that were brought in just during that first half. A lot of energy-related things. But if you go down the list, what is in common is they build capacity of these countries. And why is that evergreen? Because by building capacity for them to produce, to get their economies in order, creates jobs. Jobs creates income. Income is now disposable income, can then be used to buy needed and necessary and desired goods, which China produces a lot. So this is a very virtuous circle, very, very different from what's going on in Washington as we speak.
And Einar, China, of course, is also involved in trade with many of these countries that are BRI recipients. How do these projects drive the growth of that trade?
Well, I mean, you know, if you start looking at the very beginning at what the Belt and Road Initiative did starting over 11 years ago, you'll see that the interconnection, roads, rails, ports, bridges, everything that was necessary to bring trade to where it could be exported or imported wasn't there. Today, it is transformed, and there are more aggressive plans to do even more. Like, for instance, in South America, just looking at a map today where the planned connections in terms of roads over this huge area, rail, ports, we already have Chanquet Port, and then the question is, how do you connect it up to Brazil? These are all things that are going to make South America more independent. It's going to be a bastion of not only of goods, but also joint development. China is helping these countries by saying, look, we're going to share our technology. We're going to develop it together. Very, very different model than that which was pursued, it continues to be pursued by the US and Europe. So it's all across the board. It really is exactly what China has said. And it's not just about what they said, it's about what they've been doing for these 11 years. It's mutual benefit.
Gita, good to see you. That report that I was talking about, it also says that Indonesia was the recipient of BRI funding to the tune of $2.1 billion. What is that funding being used for, and what are the planned projects?
Well, it's been going on for the last 12 years, but if we take a look at the data points depicted by the Griffith studies and the one in Beijing, in the last 10 years, since 2015, Southeast Asia has been getting about $60 billion, of which Indonesia has been a recipient of about $20 billion. And that number was basically dispersed into four obvious sectors. The first one is, of course, energy. The second one is mining and metals. The third is transportation, and the fourth is technology. I think those four sectors are likely to stay consistently going forward throughout the duration or remaining duration of the Belt and Road Initiative. I also would like to, underline the importance of energy for Southeast Asia, given the fact that 8 out of the 10 countries in Southeast Asia are, well below the threshold of modernity in terms of electrification. Indonesia, for instance, is only electrified to the extent of 1,300 kilowatt hour per capita, much lower than the levels at, within Singapore and Brunei, which would have been at 10,000 kilowatt hour per capita. And if you add Indonesia to the other remaining Southeast Asian countries, for all of them to attain modernity, Southeast Asia would need to build about a terawatt worth of power generation capabilities. That's a significant amount, which I think needs to be, somewhat weighted more than some of the other sectors within the BRI context.
Right, Gita, you mentioned those four sectors where the BRI is involved. I just want to focus on one of them that is particularly pertinent to Indonesia, and that is transport. I mean, one of China's most significant infrastructure projects in Indonesia has been the construction of the Jakarta Bandung high-speed railway. It's known as WOOSH. There have been more than 10 million passenger trips since operation began in 2023. Can you give us some sense of the impact that has had?
Tremendously, positively. This is over a distance of 120 kilometers, to the extent that the leadership of Indonesia has agreed to extend from the city of Bandung to Surabaya. So this will be an extension of 600 kilometers worth of high-speed rail using, Chinese technology and Chinese capabilities. I think this is capital for the decision by the leadership of the Indonesian government to move ahead with the additional 600 kilometers.
I know you were talking earlier on about the Shanghai port in Peru. Chinese President Xi Jinping, as well as the Peruvian President Dina Boluarte, they attended the inauguration of that port last November. And you mentioned that, the next part of the project will be to connect the broader hinterland to that port. But already, if you look at the travel time between Shanghai and Shanghai, it's now at about 23 days. And according to the Shanghai customs authorities, the total value of imports and exports between Shanghai and Peru has already increased by over 34%. What does that tell you? How much of a game changer is this going to be?
Well, it's massive. I mean, you have to understand a little bit about South American geography. You have the Andes Mountains that basically cuts it in half. The larger half is over on the Brazil side, but you have the other side that faces the Pacific, which has been basically cut off for many, many, many years. Now, through engineering, the ability of especially Chinese engineers to do tunneling has changed that. And now, you look at South America, the majority of the countries there have, their largest trade relationship with China. Cutting down the time is really important because a lot of this involves fresh produce. So getting it to market quicker means that you can let it in the ground, let it ripen more, and it's going to be a lot more interesting to consumers in China. But it goes both ways. It just makes things easier and cheaper. Not only in terms of logistics, because you don't have those extra days, you're not spending the extra money on oil to move these big container ships. But it's just the ability to get things more quickly all the way across the board. So it's a huge game changer, and just by having that success that you mentioned, the 34%, this is the kind of impetus where people can see quite clearly that the benefits of this type of project, and hopefully it will get past some of the historical roadblocks to cooperation within South America.
All right, in looking at the potential for broader cooperation between China and Peru, I mean, where do you see that heading? In fact, President Boullate did point out that that project that we were talking about, the Shanghai project, has created something like 7,000 jobs.
Yeah, well, it's got to move up the ladder in terms of processing. Right now, for many, many years, South America has been exporting. They're the largest exporter of coffee in the world, but very little of that coffee is actually processed. They do not roast it there. They not create the blends. So a place like Italy and different parts of Europe that don't grow a single bean actually make more money on a per bean basis than the people who grow it. Now, that's an opportunity for these countries to start saying, look, we need to climb that value chain. We need to create jobs in processing. We need to control our resources and the value that is created with them, so that we're not always, in this kind of just resource curse area.
Gita, Indonesia has adopted a modernization program, a very ambitious, vigorous modernization program, and the president has vowed to continue that. It's brought rapid growth to the country. It's vaulted Indonesia into the ranks of middle-income countries, and the country is now working to create all-encompassing domestic EV and battery supply chains. China's BYD as well as GAC have pledged to build factories in the country. What can you tell us about these efforts?
Look, I think it's a start of a long journey in a positive manner. The BYD plant is due to be completed sometime this year. That's likely to employ 5,000 to 10,000 employees, and I think there's more to come. And as aptly pointed out earlier, I think it's a natural inkling for countries like Indonesia or developing economies like Indonesia to want to move up the value chain. The BRI, I think, resonates to Indonesia in a big way. The EV trajectory, I think, is going to be much more, positive and exponential going forward. Not only in terms of the adoption and consumption, but I do believe that the Chinese companies have every interest to basically allow for us to, build more capacities within this market. This will, I think, depend on the degree to which we can further build the connectivity, which will be key for, I think, the full downstreaming and consumption of more electric vehicles in the country.
Okay, and that's where we have to leave it for now. Thanks to both of you for being with us. Next, we'll take a closer look at the impact of the Belt and Road Initiative in South Africa. Stay with us. You're watching The Heat. China's investment in Africa surged to nearly $40 billion in the first half of 2025, outpacing every other region. Joining us now from Cape Town is Sanusha Naidu. She's an associate researcher with the Nelson Mandela School of Public Governance at the University of Cape Town. Sanusha, great to see you. Now, South Africa was the first African country to sign a Belt and Road Cooperation Memorandum of Understanding. That was in 2015. How has the Belt and Road Initiative in South Africa helped the country?
Good day, Anand. I think it's really a very important dynamic in terms of when you unpack the BRI or the Belt and Road in the context of Africa, and you look to see which are the beneficiary countries that have gained out of the Belt and Road. When we zoom into South Africa and look at the BRI, at times it's very difficult to disaggregate which are projects that fall under the Belt and Road Initiative. But I suspect that the one way to analyze the impact of the BRI on South Africa is to look at the sectors that have been under the kind of investment that exists between South Africa and China, the kind of strategic partnership or the elevation of the bilateral relationship to a comprehensive strategic partnership. And under that, you're seeing areas around technology, renewable energy, green energy, etc. And these are sectors that really fall under the Belt and Road. And that will definitely be important in terms of South Africa looking for investment in the president's investment vehicle, but also in terms of the infrastructure development program that the government has, and more importantly in terms of Operation Mandela, which is around infrastructure, construction, and so forth with regard to ports and so forth. So I think in that way, it does play a strategic and pivotal role in elevating the kind of development plans that South Africa has and the investment that comes from China, but not just from China state-owned enterprises, but also from the private sector in China.
Right, so let's talk about one of those sectors, that is energy in South Africa. It's a sector where South Africa has faced some major challenges. In fact, a South African policy analyst, Siseko Maposa, he said energy is key to development in the country. If you look at Africa in general, it suffered with reliable electricity supplies. Now, in May, South Africa's power utility, Eskom, said that it will take 6 years to stabilize South Africa's electricity grid. What is the situation now, and what is the government's plan?
Well, the situation now, according to a briefing by the electricity minister earlier this week or late last week, was that we do have one of the power plants coming back online, which then creates more capacity. But at the same time, what you're really having a difficulty with is supply and demand. Now, the supply is getting there in terms of regeneration of the electricity plants, but also in terms of maintenance. So for this winter, we've kind of had not the kind of load shedding or the electricity interruptions that we've seen in the past because of oversupply or demand and capacity not being synchronized. But what you do have in the context of where we need to be in our electricity with regard to the next 6 years is the fact that the municipalities, local government, a lot of the inefficiencies are located within local government in the municipalities because the infrastructure at the distribution level within these municipalities have not been maintained, or they're very old, or they basically are not able to absorb the kind of maintenance and upgrading of the electricity plants. Two, I think there's a challenge that we have in terms of the fact that we have an increase of electricity pricing. So the tariffs or the taxes that people have to pay in order to have access to the electricity, to the grid, is actually not necessarily very cheap. It's becoming more and more expensive, and the more expensive it's becoming, it's also becoming disproportionate in terms of the cost of living, and it's adding another burden to people's taxes, tariffs, and what they pay. And of course, with regard to the economic architecture, the economic growth in our country being not necessarily where it should be, we're looking at projections of lower growth rate, and of course, notwithstanding the tariff impacts in terms of the U.S. South Africa 30% tariff on certain industries that will create more potential for unemployment. This creates another added burden to the architecture. So where we are right now, I think, is really only in terms of how we try to diversify investment partners, and China is one of them, but also looking not necessarily just towards whether renewable energy is only the way to go, but also in terms of investment in some of our infrastructure plants that will deal with the electricity distribution and grid.
Well, I just want to stay with energy for a moment. How far has South Africa gone in terms of transitioning to green energy sources?
Well, we just passed not long ago in the parliament the legislation on climate change. Now that gives us a sense of what the government is trying to do in terms of addressing climate change and the impact of climate change on our renewable energy, but also in terms of our electricity outputs and distribution. The green energy transition is still very much in its infancy, according to my interpretation. Some analysts have argued that where we are in terms of where we should be, we're not really at that point where we are transitioning at the rate that we should, or at the level that we should, in terms of the green energy transition, and in terms of how much of our green transition is actually affordable, but also being financed. So this just energy transition debate is becoming more critical. But the climate change bill that has gone through Parliament, which then has to become a legislative act when the president signs it into legislation, means that we have to also think about how we change consumer behaviorism. And at the moment, we're still using a lot of coal production and coal output. So that is a big challenge for us.
Now, that bill that you're talking about, what does it do in terms of moving towards alternative sources of energy?
Well, it tries to actually define, and I'm not an expert on this, let me just say that at the beginning, so I may be completely out of sync with my analysis. But from what I could understand, what it tries to do is that it tries to position South Africa in terms of addressing how to deal with climate change, how to actually mitigate the risks around climate change. And in terms of Eskom has this in the context of the unbundling of Eskom into those three phases, in those three entities. You know, you've got procurement, you've got development, and I think it's distribution, the grid. And so these are areas where I think that with regard to the bill, it's still not actionable yet. I think there's still challenges in terms of implementation. So it's still a bill. In terms of theoretical, in terms of being on paper, it still looks at climate change and the impact that climate change has on our electricity needs and our energy needs. It's still very much part of that. But it's not just about energy or electricity. It's also about dealing with how do you deal with industries that link up to, say, maritime issues, sea issues around the blue economy. So it's just it's a bill that is very vast in its optics and very vast in what it tries to do.
Right. Now, the other big challenge for South Africa is, of course, job creation. It has one of the highest rates of unemployment in the world, and it's particularly high among young people in the country. In fact, the South African Department of Statistics shows unemployment for youth aged 15 to 34 is at 46.1%. That was in the first quarter of this year. Now, if we look at China's involvement, especially through the BRI, during last September's forum on China-Africa cooperation, the Chinese President Xi Jinping pledged $51 billion in investment for Africa as a whole. It marked somewhat of a shift away from infrastructure projects to investment in job creation. So what does that mean for a country like South Africa?
Well, I think for a country like South Africa, it means that you've got to have good plans. You've got to have a good industrial kind of program and policy. And it also means linking up with the National Development Program or plan. And so this is what the President and the Presidential Economic Advisory Council, which is dealing with some of these issues with regard to industrialization. It means investment in the right kind of skills, upgrade, educational spaces, and of course in terms of what kind of industrial base you want to create. And I know the President keeps talking, South Africa's President Ramaphosa keeps talking about how do you build that skills base and how do you bring young people into the economy in terms of the kind of investment you make in their future and their career and their professional development. Now the challenge we have is that we do have disruptors to this, not necessarily from South Africa only in terms of the industrial development plans and so forth, but also from external sources. And today we saw in local newspapers the issue around some of these disruptors, and one of them being Shane and Timu, who has disrupted our local manufacturing chain with regard to how much of jobs have been lost because they are cheap, and they're able to offer cheap access to goods online. Now this again is where the South African government would like to support this through the localization support fund, and this fund means that you got to start building those value chains and encouraging more young people to get into the industrialization base, but not just at the macro level, also in terms of SME development and so forth. So hopefully that investment from China would also go into how we create those value chains at the local level and stimulate the economy.
Right, as I mentioned, South Africa is one of the first countries to sign that memorandum. But looking at it over the years, to what extent has BRI driven trade growth between South Africa and China?
Well, we still have to unpack that. From what I could see, one of the things is that we still look at it not necessarily under the BRI banner, but we look at it in terms of China-South Africa relations, bilateral trade relations. And so when we look at the data is still very much not necessarily singling out or defining the BRI as the growth trajectory or the kind of factor that's stimulating growth in South Africa and trade between South Africa and China, but rather bilateral relations. And under bilateral relations, we see this in the context of investments in terms of things like your development corridors, some of the railways, some of the infrastructure. But we also have certain levels where the investment still remains quite defined by a deficit. So we'll have to look to see whether the data that's being given, both from the Chinese side and the South African Reserve Bank and the South African Revenue Service and DTIC, the Trade and Investment Competition Ministry, whether it's being defined according to BRI. For now, it is not about BRI. It is about bilateral trade that's stimulating growth between the two countries.
Sanusha, Naidu, thanks so much for being with us.
You're welcome.
And that's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington.